Hello family, my name is Oyama Mdleleni. I am a purpose coach. Welcome to my YouTube channel. On this channel, I talk about God's people, God's promises, and God's principles. Today, I will be talking about God's original intent about human beings. In the Bible, the book of Genesis 1, God tells us that he created the heaven and the earth, and how he did that over a period of 6 days, and he created heaven and earth. In Genesis 1, God tells us that he created heaven and the earth was without form and void. And then he further tells us how he had done that over a period of 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. Now, on day 6, God creates man. On day 6, God creates man in his image and likeness. The past 5 days, when God was dividing the land and the sea and the sun and the day and night and the animals or living creatures, God said, let there be. But now on day 6, the Bible tells us now that God said, let us make man. When God says, let us make man, God tells us that God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In the beginning, we see that all three, the God's Trinity, was involved in the creation. In the beginning, we know that this is Jesus, the Word, as John 1:1 tells us that in the beginning there was Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh. This is Jesus in the beginning. And we see that God's Spirit was hovering over the earth. We know that God is Spirit. The Bible tells us this. So when during the creation, the Bible tells us God's image and God's likeness. The Bible indicates that God is spirit, his image, his spirit, that God, also the Bible also tells us that God creates as he's creating heaven and earth. And also the Bible tells us that God spoke this word. God said, let there be, and there was. So that tells us that what God says, God means, and what God says, it is powerful and it will be. So when God now makes man or creates men and women in his image and likeness, we also embody God's image and likeness. God's image, that is spirit. That means we are spirit as human beings. And then God says that he will create us in his likeness. That means we can also create, as God is the creator. And also that as God said these things, spoke these things into existence, that means we can speak things in our lives into existence. That what we say holds power more than we can imagine. Now, as God was creating men and women, we know God creates Adam. He creates them from the dust, from the ground. He forms them from the ground, from the dust. And then he breathes through his nostrils and gives him life. This to me is the first indication that God wanted intimacy. He wanted to be involved in the creation. He did not just say it, but when he was creating man, as well as creating Adam, and he formed him, and he breathed his own breath into the man. That means that God wanted to be one with the man. He wanted to have intimacy with the man and the closeness with the man. And then now, secondly, God creates the Garden of Eden, where Adam is going to live now in the Garden of Eden. And God, in the Garden of Eden, God tells Adam not to eat from all the trees, as God has planted, has created trees with all sorts of fruits, and these trees are trees of life. And God tells him and forbids him to eat from this specific tree, that is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God tells him that Adam tends and keeps and he looks after the Garden of Eden. It seems like the Bible tells us, it seems like Adam is just living freely in the garden, living with the animals, until God realizes that he needs to create for Adam a help, a comparable help. When God creates the comparable help for Adam, the Bible tells us that God creates living creatures. From the living creatures, God finds no animal that is comparable to helping Adam, and therefore God now creates the woman from Adam's rib, as God makes Adam fall into a deep sleep, takes out his ribs and creates the woman who becomes his wife and help. Now, secondly, we see that they are naked. They are living. They are both naked, as the Bible now. This is brought to our attention now after the sin, that when they realize that they are naked. When now we know that they have been naked all this time, it shows to us that there's been intimacy between the man and the woman, and between them, there's been intimacy between God and the man, as God first created Adam, and then there's intimacy between the man and the woman, and between their partnership and God. We do not get the sense that says there's been comparison in terms of how they physically look different as men and women. There's been no comparison between the two of them, and that means they have been one together, and that they feel comfortable in the presence of God until sin is introduced to them. And then thirdly, we see that as God has forbidden them from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that the man and the woman have no knowledge of good and evil at this point before they eat from the forbidden fruit. They have no knowledge. Therefore, it says to me that if they have no knowledge of good and evil, that means they also have no knowledge of God's goodness. They have been living under the presence of God, and they do not know God's goodness. And they do not know God's goodness because they have nothing to compare it with. At this point, they don't know anything evil. And therefore, they cannot compare. If they were to know that what they were receiving from God, being in the presence of God, that was good for them, they could not compare that with anything. And therefore, they did not know that God was good. Because also the Bible, there's no indication of them showing any gratitude towards God or God's presence. They do not know this. That tells me that God was even willing to compromise them knowing his goodness to them while they were in his presence. That they did not know or acknowledge that God was being good to them, that God was good for them. God was willing to compromise that, because they could not know good without knowing evil. They could not know good without knowing evil. And therefore God rather than told them or forbid them from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So for me, this shows God's initial intent, that God just wanted to live in close proximity with men. He wanted men to be in his presence at all time. He wanted men to worry about nothing, to stress about nothing. God never intended for us to worry about anything. He just wanted us to soak in his presence, in his goodness, and live forever with him. Please share your own thoughts on what you think was God's initial intent or original intent for human beings on the description, on the comment section below. I look forward to reading your comments. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share the video. Until next time then, goodbye.